morning, everybody. Thanks for coming in so early. It's even earlier if you're from the other coast, so it can be brutal. I'm going to start off with just a little bit of information here that I think is helpful for a framework of this. We're going to be talking about Pennsylvania's new kennel laws and some of the other associated things. And I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 30 years and had always kind of thought that commercial kennels were, the bad guys. And last year, I was invited on a Royal Canin trip by my sales rep, and at about midnight in Paris, Stacy Mason from the AKC grabbed my shoulder and said, "Come with me." And she sat me down in front of her computer, and she spent well over an hour showing me photograph after photograph, thousands and thousands of photographs, honestly. While the rest of the people in her room are sleeping, and we're in France, we're looking at a computer screen with hundreds, literally hundreds of photographs of commercial kennels. And it was truly an eye-opening experience for me, and it's really changed how I look at the commercial kennel situation. So it's allowed me a chance to kind of open up and look at things a different way, and I hope for some of you this morning this is an opportunity as well, because I think that there's a lot for us to learn here from this wonderful group of panelists who are willing to get up early and be here with us. So I'm going to start off with introductions. Immediately to my right, or your left, is John Stotelle. He is a pet store owner, and he's going to have a perspective that's going to be really useful, I think, for us this morning. Then I have, Karel on the far end, Karel Miner, he's the executive director of the Berks Humane Society. Julian Prager is sitting next to him. Of course, we heard him yesterday. He's an attorney and the legislative coordinator for NAIA and the Pennsylvania Federation of Dog Clubs. And then I have Brian, who is absent, and I'm left then with Stephen Crawford, who's the managing vice president of Wojdak. Okay, and Associates. So I'm going to start the discussion. I think that probably the best place to start is to ask this group how they feel about the increased standards, and especially, I think, starting here with John, how that affects his world and what he does.
We're going to have to share the mic, so we'll pass it down, okay? Yeah. That one down there then. I am glad for the standard increases. We, as an industry, the commercial pet industry, need to be held accountable. I'm from Michigan. Michigan is very progressive. We're one of the 5 states that do require shelters to report. And so the state of Michigan has been very adamant about kennels and how they're set up and what they should do. And there's a state regulation for that. But federally, I'm happy for that. And USDA, I was in Tennessee at a time when I first started in the industry in 1977, and our store was USDA licensed. And USDA finally came to us and said, you're doing such a good job, would you please not up your license again? Because we don't have time to take care of you. But there was never any violations. But anyway, regulation is good, and it helps us on the front lines to know that somebody is inspecting, somebody is checking. The pet industry is more regulated than any other industry. My breeders have probably 5 people that overlook their shoulders, including myself. So I'm okay with regulation. I think it's fine, as long as it's not, as long as we have people like Julian that's checking it and making sure that it's not written to harm industry.
Great. Do you want to go ahead and pass the mic?
Good morning, everyone. I was introduced as the managing vice president of Wojdak Associates. Wojdak Associates is one of the most successful, long-standing government relations firms in Pennsylvania. It's been around for about 30 years, but that's not really what would interest you today. What would interest you is that for the preceding 8 years, I was the Secretary for Legislative Affairs and Chief of Staff to Governor Ed Rendell. Now, the story of how the standards for kennels got improved, enhanced, increased, broadened, deepened, and all that in Pennsylvania starts with two girls, and their names are Mandy and Ginger. Mandy and Ginger are the rescue labs that Governor Rendell brought to the governor's mansion in 2003 to move in with him. And if you talk about a rags to riches story, that surely was a rags to riches story. These dogs went from conditions that weren't so great to the governor's mansion. Not a bad trade. The thing you have to understand about Ed Rendell is that he's the kind of guy who has a had a very aggressive public policy agenda. This town is almost asleep compared to the way it was 8 years ago, simply because of the breadth and depth of the public policy agenda that Rendell brought to Harrisburg. But he never met a problem that he didn't want to solve, and he never met a problem that he didn't think he could solve. And his heart is enormous, and his heart and his feelings for animals is not transcended by much. So when the issue of, and I'm going to use some words, some terms you won't like, but you need to understand the public policy debate that occurred here. When the issue of puppy mills was brought to his attention, he was horrified. And he resolved to do something about it. He took a sleepy agency called the Department of Agriculture and a bureau that had been in a coma for decades, and he turned it on its head. We brought in a special prosecutor. We brought in a special deputy secretary. We insisted that there be standards for people who get employed by the Bureau of Dog Law. It was no longer to be considered a political passion for someone's third cousin who couldn't get a job anywhere else in the world. And that had been the case for many years, I know, because I used to be a deputy secretary of agriculture. And he turned this issue on its head. Now, the truth is that the speed with which this legislation got introduced and got passed in 2008 had a whole lot more to do with the singular passion and commitment of one guy and the stupidity of two others than anything else. The one guy I just talked about, the stupidity of the two others, were the Zimmerman brothers, who in 2008, out of the sheer fear of regulations that didn't even take effect yet, they weren't even in law, shot 80 of their dogs in Berks County. The legislation had been introduced in 2008, in the spring of 2008. It was stalled in the House of Representatives. The minute that happened, I knew that legislation would pass, because it so demonized the, quote, puppy mill, end quote, industry in Pennsylvania that no one could say no to this legislation. And from that moment forward, I knew that it was simply a matter of time until we got it done. And let me tell you, up until that point, I had Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, people from the T, people from the cities saying, come on, you know, we have a budget to pass, we have a deficit, we're proposing tax increases, we're proposing broad sweeping standards to education. Well, what's with this dog stuff? What's with the dog stuff? And I'm the guy who had to go talk to these people about the priorities of the administration and, you know, sell these things. And I had all kinds of leverage at my disposal. But the single most important thing that happened during 2008 to move that legislation along was the simple execution of 80 dogs. So we passed the legislation in October of 2008. It was signed during the week of the World Series. I remember that very well because it was signed outside of the city of Philadelphia, and I was very glad to be at the dog law signing. It was an emotional time to get all that stuff done because coincidentally, you know, all politics being local, the chairman of the Agriculture Committee in the Senate, a great guy named Mike Brubaker, he could have stopped this legislation, by the way, and did the right thing. And his executive director happened to be my wife. So she said, will you please turn off the emails from France? I said, I have nothing to do with these emails from France, honey. It's not me. I just work here. I don't even know how to run a computer, really. We need more emails coming from France. So
You're on record now.
that's right. So when the legislation passed, we did the signing. It was a great week because the Phillies won the World Series and we got the talk about legislation passed. But let me say this, and I'll turn it over to Julian. To this day, there are people who think that we didn't do enough. As much as we did, they think we didn't do enough, and it galls me because it cost a lot to get this done. Political capital is not infinite, and it cost us a ton to get that done in 2008. And I left a lot of my life just the sheer stress of the job that I had, and I count, various issues and vignettes. I see vignettes where it was a very, very difficult thing, and I watched Ed Rendell bleed over this issue. And so did I. We got it done. And to this day, there are people that think that we didn't do enough. You'll see billboards on the turnpike that criticize us, demonize us, because we, for whatever reason, we didn't go far enough, or we capitulated, or we had to compromise. Well, guess what? That's what we did. But we did get it done. So I'm very proud of the fact that we did. If we're serving Bloody Marys later, I'll be glad to tell you more stories about how this legislation got passed, because it's a 3-drink minimum. There are lots of stories. There are lots of stories within the stories. But I'm very, very proud of the fact that we did it, and we did it in a science-based manner. That's the thing I'll leave you with, is, these issues are very, very emotional. They're more guaranteed, we're in the middle of a child sex abuse scandal at Penn State University, which is just awful. But I bet you that at the end of the day, there will have been more people weighed in on the issue of puppy mills in Pennsylvania in 2008. They're going to weigh in on abused children at Penn State in 2011. Proud of the fact that we got it done. But there are people out there who still think that we didn't do it right, we need to do it over, or we need to do more.
Is this working? Good. I think I'm here, I said to Patty, because I'm known as a credit to my profession among folks like you sometimes, which I guess is funny to me. I am not actually among the more strident, and I think we can name the more strident as people like Bill Smith, who really does want to bring an end to breeding, period, unless it's one of his friends on the main line.
And raised a lot of money in the meeting.
Raised a lot of money. However, I have a reputation for being somewhat of a firebrand as well, and I think one of the problems that the folks on the breeding end are facing is there are a lot more people like me professionalizing the animal welfare and the sheltering world who know the difference between politics and a blog and then how to get behind the scenes and actually get something passed. And while we were one of the louder voices on occasion, we were also the ones who were back willing to make the deals that needed to be done to get something passed, and we, I think, did. I would say that there are alternate versions of some of what has been presented here, and I think that where things started to fall apart were not the regulations themselves, but the fact that now they're being selectively enforced, if enforced at all. I was just saying that the Penn State scandal was fortunate in that it reminded us there actually is a governor of Pennsylvania, because it's the first time I have seen him live on camera since the election day, I think, talking about this. And what I think we kept in mind going forward was we were not actually, as much as we used puppy mills because that was the jingo that needed to be used, there's a difference between breeding. In fact, there's a difference between puppy mills and what we were addressing in our county who had this implements. There are dog farmers, and I don't care what you guys think about us or what we think about you. I don't see any dog farmers in this audience, and they would stand out. And the fact is, dogs should not be farmed like cattle, like chickens, like hogs. They're not production animals. And every time I say that, then somebody on my side calls me a speciesist. But the reality is, dogs are different. And what we want to see, and increasingly what we're starting to see from people like me, is in fact a middle ground that recognizes that people like purebred dogs for a reason. There's a reason I have a yellow Labrador other than I live in Chester County. It's because I want a particular kind of dog that acts a particular way and behaves as I'm going to expect it to because it is what it is. And I have no problem with that. And when people come to our organization and they say, I want a dog that is like this, we narrow down, do you want to fall in love with a dog, or do you want to fall in love with a dog that is like the description you're giving? And if that's the case, we might have one in the kennel. Otherwise, go to your vet and find a reputable breeder who can give you that dog. Because when you go get the pit bull mix, or the golden retriever mix, or the mix, it's not necessarily going to be that. So I think the problem that you will be facing going forward, and the reason that if you're not flexible, is that there are more people, especially as the suburbanization of our state starts to happen, who would just as soon see no breeders, period, many more of them, than in the old days where breeders were farmers. Farmers had the ag lobby behind them, and nothing could touch them. And I think what really came out of that was there were suburban and urban areas who were controlling the debate in Pennsylvania in a way that they never had, and in a way that they don't in Missouri and other places where the fights are happening because it's more rural controlling this debate. So I think if you actually will, and I hopefully Julian will agree with this, if you'll find people like me who in fact will whip their troops up as they need to push something forward, but in reality can get in a room and work out a deal, you're going to find yourself with much better legislation being passed, because it's going to be passed whether you like it or not. There's only so much you can block, and eventually Democrats will be back in control of Harrisburg, and the next round will happen, because this is in fact a partisan issue. So that's the most I can offer. It's going to happen. Pick your partners well.
Well, you certainly understand why you're here. That's let me just give my historical perspective on this, because when the law was first contemplated, my initial reaction was, why do we want to deal with commercial kennels? Because what you care about are substandard kennels. And by the way, that's what they are. They're substandard kennels. And the same law really ought to apply to all of us, because we all want dogs to be treated humanely. There's nobody, I don't think there was anybody in this discussion who was going to stand up and say, yeah, I'm the one who thinks dogs ought to be abused. But as the discussion went on, what we found was that there were alliances and groups who were totally opposed to this going forward, and there were groups who saw a need for some change. And, you know, although Bill Smith and I, God knows, do not see eye to eye on much, we were on the same side in lobbying this bill as it went forward, because we saw a need to improve the conditions in substandard kennels. And once, from our perspective, we said, okay, you believe that commercial kennels are not doing things the right way. But we don't want to be subjected to all the things that you think commercial kennels ought to do to improve, because we have standards that we follow. They may not be the same written standards that you want into this bill, but our dogs get veterinary care because we realize it's in our interest for our dogs to get veterinary care. Our dogs aren't bred on every heat cycle, year after year, because we realize that's not the healthiest thing for the dog. Now, there's an argument, certainly, you know, do you breed back to back and then skip? And how should you do it? But that's an intelligent discussion that people are having about what's the best method, as opposed to just doing it because it produces puppies. And the question became, well, how are we going to move this forward? And in talking to the legislature. We put together a coalition, quite frankly, on our side. And I'm not talking about, with Bill Smith, but we had the Sportsman's Alliance, we had the hunt clubs, we had the private kennels, which in Pennsylvania are the people who are hobby and show breeders. We had the commercial, where you leave your dog for the weekend. What the hell is it? Boarding camp, thank you. Yeah, and we actually got together, and initially we invited the commercial kennels to come onto the phone with us, and we would have conference calls to discuss how do we want this legislation to move forward. And at some point in those discussions, the commercial kennels stopped participating, and that's where they lost it, because we had gotten to the point in this discussion before it passed the House where we were going to get somebody to take our bill to the floor, which contained the language that we thought was appropriate. And then the commercial kennels left. We said, okay, now wait a second, I'm willing to fight their fight to get reasonable regulations for them and a reasonable law for them, but I'm not willing for them to say there's nothing that needs to be done. That's crazy. So at that point we said, okay, we're not going to fight their fight anymore. They're going to have to fight their own fight. We're going to fight our fight. And that's what we did. We got language put into the statute that we felt protected us, some of which I mentioned yesterday. You go to a private kennel, find a problem, you get a notice of violation, you don't get a citation, you get a chance to correct it, and that's perfectly fine. That gives a responsible person a chance to be educated, a chance to come into compliance. If they don't come into compliance, shame on them, then they get penalized. And that's what we worked for from that point on. And as Steve said, you go and you shoot dogs, which is, by the way, legal in Pennsylvania, but as a public relations act, it just blew things apart. And there was no doubt that the bill was going to pass at that point. And the only question was, what was it going to contain? Do I think the whole process could have been done better? Yeah, I think from one perspective, and one perspective only, and I talked a little bit about this yesterday, which was the Canine Health Board. It's kind of hard if you don't know what the regulations are that are going to govern you, to know what changes you need to make. And so a lot of the commercial kennels had a problem since the law went into effect, but the Canine Health Board regulations hadn't been written and hadn't been accepted. And so they said, well, I don't, you're going to tell me what I have to do about temperature, but I don't know what I have to do to reconstruct my kennel in order to meet those temperature requirements, because I don't know what they are yet. I mean, I know what the limits are, but I don't know how I can address them. I don't know what I can do about indoor versus outdoor exercise. Outdoor exercise is required, but I can get a waiver for indoor exercise, but are they going to give me a waiver? I don't know. So what the hell do I do about this? I think if we had been a little bit quicker in getting that part of it settled, it would have given the commercial industry a better opportunity to voluntarily come into compliance or clearly not be in compliance. So we would know who the good guys are and the bad guys are more clearly. But again, as I said yesterday, I think that this bill, whether it's enforced exactly as it's written or not, the bill itself is a good bill. There are minor issues on the edges, but basically it is clearly written. It sets out clear standards. You know what you have to do, and you can get it done. Marty, you got a hand up?
You have a question?
Would you mind finding a commercial kennel?
In Pennsylvania, the statute, and we argued long and hard about this. One of the things you need to keep in mind is that the American Kennel Club had determined that of its breeders, an extremely small percentage sell more than 50 dogs a year. So when the statute was written, A commercial kennel was defined as a kennel, and a kennel in Pennsylvania is also kind of a strange duck, because it doesn't depend on how many dogs you have at one time. It depends on how many dogs you have over the course of a year. So if you have more than 25 dogs over the course of a year, you are some type of kennel. If you transfer, and the word transfer is exactly the same word that's being used in the federal regulations on dog imports, if you transfer more than 60 dogs a year, you are a commercial kennel. So it basically does not affect the small hobby and show breeders. It doesn't affect the sportsmen who, may be breeding dogs for their own use, or maybe exchanging, some dogs on the periphery between kennels. But if you transfer 60 dogs a year, you are a commercial kennel and have to come under the commercial kennel regulations.
Do you have a question?
Just real quick on that same point. So am I correct in understanding that the presence of a business license or an incorporated LLC does not define commercial kennel, it's strictly volume?
That's correct.
What was the question?
The question was, do you have to have a business license or some kind of commercial operation to be or business operation to be a commercial kennel? And the answer is no. There is no regulatory requirement. In fact, interestingly enough, in Pennsylvania, the tax law states that you are permitted to engage in 3 transactions a year, and a single transaction can include any number of dogs without paying sales tax. So you're actually, if you only sell 3 dogs a year, or if you sell, 6 dogs to 3 people in 3 transactions, you're not required to collect sales tax. You're not required to report sales tax. At least as I understand it.
Yeah, each state has their own criteria. In Wisconsin, ours ended up to be if you sell, transfer, anything for consideration, 25 or more dogs, or puppies from more than 3 litters, that made you a large-scale breeder. Well, if you're a co-owner on a litter, it doesn't take very long to get to that number. So we've got people affected in Wisconsin that certainly wouldn't, by most people in this room's criteria, be considered a commercial breeder. So every state kind of does things a little bit differently. One of the other things
Can I jump in quickly?
Sure.
One thing, if you're not from Pennsylvania, it also does not apply to nonprofit kennels like ours. And before he goes, I advocated for having it apply to nonprofit kennels because there are tons of shelters that would not pass. My guess on why that wasn't the case is the state needs places for stray dogs to go, and had they required us to have the same rules, those places would have said, we can't afford to do both, take your dog someplace else. So I think, personally believe that was a political decision to exempt us, to get votes for some sort of bill to go through, but also to put off the whole animal control issue, which is a huge problem in Pennsylvania.
So that brings us to the question of whether we really believe that the standards for commercial kennels should be or need to be different for any other kind of kennel. And nonprofits are one kind, but there's different classifications in Pennsylvania that are different than other states. So would Julian or Steve, you want to comment on that?
A couple things. One, I want to make sure you understand that as partisan as it may have appeared, the issue of passing the dog law, the kennel standards was not partisan. It was actually regional. In Pennsylvania, if you're not from Pennsylvania, the average Southwestern Democrat is more conservative than the average Southeastern Republican. A very conservative part of the top part of the state, running down through the middle, we call that the T. But we've had divided government until 2011, and frankly, it's still divided. But we've had divided government, so we had a Democrat governor, Democrat-controlled House, and a Republican-controlled Senate. So at the end of the day, we had to count on some pretty forward-thinking Republicans in the Senate, politically smart and compassionate to help us move that legislation. With regard to the standards and what they should be moving forward, you need to know that In my job as chief of staff to the governor, I had to manage the transition from one administration to the next. I had the opportunity to have a conversation with Governor-elect Corbett, and I warned him that there were those within the Republican Party who were salivating at the thought of him becoming governor because they thought they could turn the clock back on the changes that we made in 2008. That was part of the transition report from his transition team regarding the Department of Agriculture. And it was a specific recommendation that they revisit this issue and essentially retrench from all of the things that we had advanced in 2008. I told him that if I could give him one piece of advice, would be to not touch that issue, to let it rest, because it was so contentious and so divisive that it wasn't the kind of thing that he would want to, and this is sort of a self-interested thing for me to say, but it wasn't the kind of thing that he would want to waste his political energy on in his first term. He has since adopted 2 dogs named Penny and Harry. Penny for Pennsylvania and Harry for Harrisburg. I thought there was 2 names. It's all right. It's not my job to name the dogs. He actually did it with a contest with kids, but they're still stupid names. But to your specific question, I believe, and I was raised on a farm. The animal husbandry practices, that is, those kind of practices that allow for an animal to be raised in a humane, safe, and biosecure, if you will, environment, don't have a lot to do with the size of an operation. They have a lot more to do with the practices of the operation, be it big or small. But politically, you've talked about a factory farm or a puppy mill. That's a whole lot different with the dynamic of a conversation than if you talk about a backyard for your breeder or someone who just has a small, we call them mom and pop in politics world. Nobody ever wants to pick on mom and pop. Mom and pop can be screwing the consumer left and right, but they're mom and pop. So, well, Walmart, we're going to come and get you. Mom and pop, you're good to go. Mom and pop always gets a pass in legislation. There's always that small business carve out. So when you threw, if you will, if the Julian, when the commercial guys decided to take a walk, you did the absolute right thing by suggesting that they can walk, but they're going to walk that plank all by themselves, and that's exactly what they did. So the next step for Pennsylvania will be not to advance further regulations, but it will be to protect the ones that you've got, because there's still a strain of folks out there who want to fight this fight all over again. And there are lobbyists who will take their money to do it, and it will have to be vigilant.
Yeah, one other thing, and just to explain, because Pennsylvania is somewhat different from other jurisdictions. In many places, your dog ordinances are set up locally and entirely controlled locally. Pennsylvania has a state dog law, and there are a couple of areas where there are exceptions, and you can have your local dog law differ, but basically it's run by the state. And we've been talking to the legislative staff, and they've frankly told us that this administration understands nobody wants to deal with the dog law again. Any dog legislation, because it's a single state area, nothing's going to pass, and that's both good and it's a problem. And it's a problem because license fees are set in state law, and we've argued for a long time that the license fees actually need to be increased. All of the funding for animal control comes out of a restricted account, which gets its money from the license fees and from the fines that are imposed for violation of the dog law. And there are no state revenues from the general fund going into that process. So if you can't open the dog law you can't change the licensing fees. And we went forward when they were discussing this dog law issue, and for political reasons, obviously, this couldn't be made part of the changes to the dog law. But the kennel clubs that I spoke to were perfectly happy to increase kennel licensing fees. They didn't see any problem with it. It cost me to have up to a total of $50 a year on my property, $75 a year, instead of licensing them, each of them individually. So, for me, it's cheaper to have a kennel license. I wouldn't mind, and our discussions were, okay, let's charge $150 for a basic kennel license. Then let's increase it. And the proposal that we had was, let's make this simple to pass. All right, it's $150 for up to 50 dogs. And above that, 10 cents a dog. Now, there are dealer kennels that handle 9,000 dogs a year. They're paying a couple of $100 in license fees. But if you put it at 10 cents a dog, who the heck is going to be able to successfully argue that that's an unreasonable fee? And that's the direction we should have gone in. Now, on the other side of this, you've got some places like Philadelphia, and I got to tell you, Philadelphia is not the place to live if you want to have a kennel. Philadelphia has something. First of all, it's got a limit law, which the state courts have struck down in a number of cases, so I don't know how the hell that still exists. But their limit law says you can have 12 dogs on your property. And that means that if you live in a condominium with 50 apartments, you can have 600 dogs in that condominium. And if you live on a 2-acre piece of property, you can have 12 dogs. Doesn't make any sense. They passed a new law, which I believe violates the state law, but which now the only way we can deal with it is to have somebody sue them. They established this maximum number of dogs, and then if you have between 13 actually, and 25, you have to get a Philadelphia kennel license. Well, that's reasonable, that, if they want to do that. But then they gave themselves the authority to inspect state dog law kennels. And the state dog law says the only people who can inspect state dog law kennels are people who work for the Department of Agriculture. How did they give themselves this right? How is nobody challenging this? It's incredible.
Okay, good. I'd like to get a little bit more of an opportunity to understand the commercial kennel goals, and I'd like for John to address kind of what his ideal would be.
First, and I've listened to these three guys talk, and Marty said some things like this yesterday. Let's stop using the word commercial kennel because there's no definition. Let's call them high volume breeder or large scale breeder, and then everybody kind of knows what we're talking about. And then puppy mill, of course, and Julian said earlier, substandard breeder. That's what we're working at, is standards. And we need the breeders that we're buying from to have standards because we want to get healthy dogs to give to our consumers and sell to our consumers. So some of the things that we do, most of our breeders are 25 dogs or less. I have purchased in past years from large-scale breeders of 700 dogs. I've been there. I've traveled the United States and seen probably over 300 kennels, and some of them very large, some of them very small, and I've seen abuse in all of them, and in all sizes, not in all of them, in all levels. What we need to do is to help the people that are doing it well, to protect them, as they've said, and allow them to do what they do. But the people that are doing it poorly either raise the standard or stop doing it. And we have to get to that point. So what we do in my company, as of about 5 years ago, we decided we won't buy from a kennel unless we've physically been there. So that we can say to our consumers and to our staff, I've been there. I know this person. I know this breeder. I've sat and ate dinner with them in their home. And I know the facility they have. And that's a hard thing for the pet industry to do. I'm fortunate that I have 5 stores, and I have a little bit more free time to do that. Most pet shops don't have that freedom. What we've done though, and you can see it on our website, because if I took the time to go through all the standards and all the regulations we put in our readers, we'd be here for 3 more days. But you can go to thefamilypuppy.com, and we have listed, tried to be very bold and very transparent. That's a good word, isn't it? A new word. With the animal rights groups and with you, to tell you what our requirements are, and to tell you and tell our consumers what we do before we bring that puppy into our facility, into our stores. So you'll see a lot of them. I'll just list off a couple of them. Exercise pens, we have mandated as of about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that every breeder have an exercise pen. We've transitioned that into now, most of the kennels don't use a pen per se to exercise, and these things are now, this was before the law required exercising. We did that because we knew that was right. And now they have transitioned away from a pen to what we call a perimeter playground, a perimeter fenced playground. So their yard is basically their exercise area. And these 25 dogs, they will get them all out and let them run and play. And we really thought that we'd have a war. You can imagine putting 25 dogs together, and we thought we'd have fights. I was really concerned about that when I presented that to the breeders. We haven't seen that. There's an occasional Yorkie that likes to rule the root, and we'll retire him. But typically they get along. As long as they have enough space, they do fine. And so I've been to many kennels where they get them out, they just run and play, and what they've ended up getting to the point where is they will not even be too concerned about which kennel they go back into, because these dogs are now social, and they get along with each other, and they play with each other. And what better would be for 25 dogs to run and play rather than to be cooped up in a cage all day long, as you hear the animal rights groups tell you about. The socialization is huge. Dog-to-dog socialization is huge. We're doing pat testing, very similar to what shelters would do when they get an inbound, to look at the breeding stock to make sure that we're breeding temperament dogs, dogs that can pass the pat test and a personal aptitude test. The puppies, dog-to-dog socialization with a puppy at 4 weeks of age is huge. We know Dr. Ian Dunbar, many of you heard that name, and our goal is to get every puppy to meet and greet 100 different puppies, 100 different animals or people before they're 12 weeks of age. And we accomplished that very easily because these puppies are meeting different litters from the age of 4 weeks on. And then when they get to the store, they're meeting many, many different people in the retail facility. We'll go to, we do biosensor. I don't know if you heard of biosensor. We encourage our breeders to start neonatal stimulation at 3 days, 3 to 10 days. We can tell which dogs the breeders are using biosensor. They're very active. They're coming to the front of the kennels. So we're developing a much better dog. Kennel design is huge. We're trying to come up with a model kennel, and the newest one is in Indiana. That was just worked on for years. The indoor room, you talk about socialization and exercise, you can get them out into the playgrounds, into the yards, but what happens when it's 8 inches of snow on the ground? What happens in the days when it's 85 degrees or 95 degrees? We're asking them to build a building that has probably a 40-foot play area, we call it a romper room, inside their building, that on the inclement weather days or the hot days, they can get those dogs out and socialize them in a picketed fence area inside the building that's heated and cooled. Exercise is big. We've seen the breeders see that productivity goes up. They love their dogs even more because they're interacting with them. It's been a great transformation in the last 5 years or so, and so we're continuing to move that. Genetic testing, I had the joy to sit with Dr. Smith at our table, and we are now encouraging all breeders to genetic test. We start with what we see problems, and the biggest problem we see probably is luxating patellas, and we see heart murmurs. So very easily we can test all of those the breeding stock for patellas and hearts and have them OFA certified. We're working on other genetic issues, but we're starting with the ones that we see most occurrence of, and that's where we go with that. Confirmation, Large-scale breeders breed, and this is the industry, they breed well. I was talking to Dr. Smith, and she said she got a Boston Terrier that from a pet store that is kind of like a mini boxer because he's very tall, very large. Great dog, great personality, but you wouldn't dare consider him conformation anywhere close. So we've asked them to retire dogs that are too big. Well, they bred big dogs because they breed better. And it's easier to breed a bigger Yorkie than to breed a 5-pound Yorkie. You know that. We've tried to get them to cut back on and work on conformation over time. And that's been a great joy to see that happen.
Okay, great. That, I think, does a great job of helping us understand a lot of these issues a little bit better. We've got about 5 minutes left before Dr. Waters comes on, and I'm kind of a Dr. Waters groupie, so we have to be on time for this. But I think if we give everybody just another minute or two with the mic, that if you have any final, very brief comments for us, just so that everyone has a little summary here.
I'll make mine quick. First, what you're talking about, if that is what everybody would do, you wouldn't, well, you'd still get arguments for Bill Smith, but you wouldn't get many. But the problem with that is you have to charge to do that. And realistically, when you have high volume places that are not doing a good job, they undercut your ability to charge what you should be charging. And that's one of the big problems, which is why they should be put out of business so you can charge a fair rate for what you're doing properly. The other thing that we have in Pennsylvania is, and the reason that I have some sympathy for the number of waivers put out, indoor-outdoor kenneling sounds wonderful to people who know nothing about kennels, but it's not the kennel that I'm planning on building when we redesign our kennels, because in Pennsylvania you have one nice day in the spring, one nice day in the fall, and then it's too damn hot and too damn cold for the animals. So that's not necessarily the best thing to do, and some of these restrictions were, literally down to the inch, and it needs to be this, even if that's not the best thing, but it's better than what these jerks that are farming dogs have when they've got them in plywood pens. And the last thing, and I tried to come up with a way that this was not insulting, but I just can't because it's the best example, so my apologies. You are a group of people who are the equivalent of high-class call girls who want to pretend that there are not streetwalkers being beaten by their pimps. Or a junkie who is functional and thinks that there aren't, meth heads out there ruining their lives. You need to remember that because you're good at something doesn't mean that there are not just scumbags out there who are hurting and killing dogs, screwing over the people that are their customers who are buying them, and are making all of you look bad. And, so the thing to remember is because you're good at what you do doesn't mean that everybody else isn't doing something badly. Recognize that, and like I said, I tried really hard to find a good example of it.
What do the shelters do?
I guess you're at Jogn.
Let me jump in. I think I've said multiple times, half the people working in shelters today should be fired, half the shelters that are open today should be closed. That simple.
So are you a call girl too? No?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the difference is, I'm a super high class, I know it, I charge for it. And I don't pretend that I have some solidarity with the scum in my field who are doing something just because they're in my field. They're different, they shouldn't be walking the streets doing what they're doing.
Yeah, I mentioned yesterday that the Dog Law Advisory Board visited a dealer kennel as one of the types of kennels we were going to take a look at. And that guy had a fantastic operation because he was doing it exactly the right way. He had all the dogs health checked. He would do, he would see that if there was a problem with a litter, he would not buy a repeat breeding from that litter because he knew it was a problem. He understood that it was better for him economically to sell healthy dogs than it was to sell sick dogs. And he was doing everything he could to educate the people in his community that that was the way they should do business because it produced more income, which is what they're looking for. They're looking for income. Nothing wrong with having income. We all want income, but the question is, how do you get it? And if we can have kennels, high-volume kennels, that are doing it the right way and have dogs that are not abused dogs that are treated properly, dogs that are not overbred. That's exactly what we want. Because there's no other way that we are going to address the issue of the number of dogs that people in the United States want to have. We're not going to do it. We don't produce that number of dogs. We don't want to produce that number of dogs. I don't want to produce bulldogs for everybody who wants to have one. Because there are some people I wouldn't be selling to, you know, no matter what they were offering me. We had one dog a couple of years ago. Somebody was coming to take a look at puppies, and he walked in, and we looked at him, and he decided he liked one of our older dogs, and he offered us $5,000 for him, $6,000 for him. I just kept saying no, because you can't have my dog. That's my dog. That's the dog I'm going to show, for one thing. You know, he was a potential show dog, and he finished, but he's not for sale. Money doesn't buy everything you want to have. So let's just up the standards, get people to do the right thing.
Well, I'm a lobbyist now, so I'm the only whore in the room. He's right, and I know it's offensive, but he's right. If you do not police yourselves, there's a whole world of politicians, elected officials, and advocates out there who would love to do it for you. Most public policy professionals, most elected people, really don't care 1/10 about your industry to the degree that you do, but they get it foisted upon them by outside events. There are 253 members of the legislature, 252, and one governor. Most of the members of the legislature of Pennsylvania really didn't care that much about this issue, but it was something they had to deal with. So the lesson here is, you've got to, I wrote down 3 words, and I say this to any organization that wants to affect public policy: awareness, education, then advocacy. Go out, get to know the people who are going to decide the policies that influence your profit margin. Get to know them before you have a problem. Educate them, and then advocate. But if they don't know you, they're not going to know you. And someone else will be glad to define who you are, what you do, and how it should be regulated. That's the lesson.
Just like Julian said, the gentleman that he wouldn't sell a dog to, that guy's going to buy a dog somewhere. I guarantee you he bought a dog, because he's got enough money to do it. Wouldn't you rather have him buy a dog from a store that has put some guidelines in place than to get one from the corner of somebody selling one out of a box? And our stores are regulated, as I said, has more regulation in a large-scale facility than anybody else. Let's work together. And we're all picked apart. When I met Patty about 3.5 years ago, I almost cried because there's somebody else out there fighting for the same problem and trying to fight the animal activists. And we need to stop being so segmented. And we need to work together. And if there are bad breeders, they need to go. If there are good breeders, let's support them. Let's teach them. That's what I've been able to do, is to teach these breeders some genetics, some conformation, some standards. I need your help. And so please, please, I know I'm the enemy. I'm not a whore, but I'm an enemy. So please, please, I'd be happy to talk to anybody. I'm here till tomorrow, and I'd be happy to talk to you how we can partner together. And that's probably a bad word, partner. How we can use your expertise to teach these breeders and to raise the standard of what's happening in these commercial kennels.
I want to thank all 4 of you for being here. This was kind of a possible, well, it was a little brave to come out here and say some of the things you did. So I applaud you, and I really appreciate how we really do have a lot more in common than we have that separates us. Thank you.